The morning she watched her father's company sign over to a stranger, Marisol Vantry didn't know that stranger had once held her daughter's hand at a hospital bedside and begged her to stay. She didn't know his name yet. She only knew she'd lost everything her family had built, and somewhere in the boardroom shadows, a man named Callum Reyes watched her world collapse, and felt nothing but the quiet ache of a promise she'd broken 5 years before. If you believe people deserve second chances, and that kindness has a way of finding its way back to us, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House. Now, let's begin. 5 years earlier, Callum Reyes was a 30-year-old single father raising his 4-year-old son, Theo, alone in a cramped apartment above a laundromat in Ohio. Theo's mother had left when the boy was barely 2, unable to handle the weight of motherhood, and Callum had built his entire world around his son, working 2 jobs, skipping meals so Theo never would, and dreaming, quietly, of a life where his son wouldn't have to grow up watching his father count coins for groceries. It was during Theo's second hospitalization for a severe asthma attack that Callum met Marisol. She was a nurse then, before she inherited her father's logistics company, Vantry Freight Solutions. She worked the night shift, and she was the one who sat with Callum in the hallway at 3 a.m., bringing him coffee he couldn't afford to buy himself, listening to him talk about his son with a tenderness that broke something open in her. Marisol wasn't just a nurse to Callum during those weeks, she became a lifeline. She helped him understand Theo's treatment plan, advocated for him when insurance denied coverage, and one night, when Callum broke down in the hospital chapel, terrified he'd lose the only person who mattered to him, she made him a promise. She told him that no matter what happened, she would always be there, for him, for Theo, as a friend, as family, as someone he could count on when the world felt too heavy to carry alone. For 2 years after Theo recovered, Marisol kept that promise. She visited on weekends, brought Theo books and small toys, helped Callum fill out applications for a small business loan when he decided to start his own trucking company. She believed in him before anyone else did. She told him he had the mind of someone who could build something extraordinary, and for the first time in his life, Callum believed it too. Then her father fell ill, and everything changed. Marisol was pulled into the family business, thrust into a world of shareholders and mergers and expectations she'd never asked for. The visits grew shorter, then stopped altogether. The phone calls went unanswered. And when Callum's fledgling trucking company hit a financial crisis, when he needed just one signature, one favor, one call to a bank where her family had influence, Marisol didn't answer. She was 3 weeks away from taking over as CEO, drowning in her own inherited chaos, and Callum's messages disappeared into a silence that lasted months. He lost the company. He lost the small warehouse he'd leased with everything he had. He lost, for a while, the belief that people meant what they said. Theo, then 9, watched his father sit at their kitchen table night after night, staring at foreclosure notices, and though Callum tried to hide his devastation, children always know more than adults think they do. But Callum didn't collapse. He couldn't, not with Theo watching. Instead, something hardened in him, quiet and resolute. He took a job as a logistics coordinator for a mid-sized shipping company, learned everything he could about the industry from the inside, and started making calculated, patient decisions. He studied contracts late at night after Theo fell asleep. He built relationships with investors who saw something steady and unshakable in this soft-spoken man who never raised his voice but never backed down either. Within 2 years, he'd started a new company, smaller, leaner, but built on principles Marisol had once told him mattered: reliability, honesty, and treating people like they were worth keeping promises to. Over the next 5 years, Callum's company, Northbridge Logistics, grew from 3 trucks to a regional operation spanning 4 states. He didn't do it for revenge. He told himself, and believed it, that he was building something for Theo, something that could never be taken away because it was built on his own 2 hands, not on anyone else's promise. Meanwhile, Vantry Freight Solutions began to crumble. Marisol, Thrust into leadership too young and too unprepared, made decisions under pressure from board members who didn't respect her. She trusted the wrong people. She signed contracts she didn't fully understand. Slowly, methodically, the company her father had spent 30 years building began hemorrhaging money, client contracts, and credibility. By the time she realized how deep the damage went, it was too late to reverse course quietly. The company needed a buyer, or it would collapse into bankruptcy, taking hundreds of employees' livelihoods down with it. Callum learned about Vantry's situation through an industry contact, almost by accident, during a logistics conference in Chicago. He remembered the name instantly. His hands actually trembled holding his coffee cup when he heard it. For a long moment, old memories surfaced, Marisol's hand on his shoulder in that hospital hallway, her voice promising him he wasn't alone, and then the silence that followed, the silence that nearly broke him. He didn't act out of bitterness. That was the thing people would misunderstand later, when the story became public. Callum sat with the information for 3 days, turning it over, asking himself honestly what he wanted. And what he realized, sitting on his porch one evening watching Theo, now 14, shoot basketball hoops in the driveway, was that he wanted to build something meaningful from the wreckage of what broke him. He wanted to prove, mostly to himself, that the man who'd once been powerless in that hospital hallway no longer was. Acquiring Vantry Freight Solutions required capital far beyond what Northbridge Logistics had on hand. Callum spent the next 4 months in a grueling process most people never see, meetings with private equity firms, sleepless nights building financial models, presentations to skeptical investment boards who questioned whether a man who'd started with 3 trucks could responsibly manage an 11-figure acquisition. He believed in the vision so thoroughly, and had built such a reputation for integrity in the industry, that slowly, doors began opening. Investors who'd worked with him before vouched for him. Banks that had once denied him small loans now competed for the opportunity to back him. When Callum finally secured the financing, $1.1 billion, an amount that still felt surreal to him even as he signed the documents, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt, strangely, sad. Sad for the young woman who'd once sat with him in a hospital hallway with such genuine kindness in her eyes, and sad for whatever pressures had turned her into someone who couldn't keep a simple promise when he needed her most. The acquisition became public knowledge on a Tuesday morning. Marisol, 36 now, sat in her office reading the press release with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, seeing Callum's name, a name she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years, attached to the company that had swallowed her father's life's work. She requested a meeting immediately, expecting confrontation, expecting anger, perhaps even expecting to see triumph in his eyes. Instead, when she walked into the conference room 3 days later, she found Callum sitting alone, dressed simply, none of the corporate armor she'd braced herself for. He stood when she entered, old habits, old respect that hadn't fully died, and gestured for her to sit. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was Marisol who broke first, her voice cracking as she said she was sorry, that she'd thought about that broken promise more times than he could imagine, that becoming CEO too young had nearly destroyed her, and that abandoning him during his crisis was the decision she regretted most in her entire life. She told him about the isolation of leadership, the family expectations that crushed her spirit, the guilt she'd carried silently for years, never finding the courage to reach out because she didn't know how to face what she'd done. Callum listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her something that surprised them both. He said he hadn't bought her company for revenge. He'd bought it because he believed, underneath everything, that broken promises didn't have to be the end of someone's story, that people could rebuild, could earn back trust, could become better than the worst moment that defined them. He offered her something no one expected, a leadership position within the newly merged company, not as a gift, but as a genuine opportunity to prove herself again, this time with him watching, not as someone waiting for her to fail, but as someone who understood, more than most, how much a second chance could mean. Marisol wept in that conference room, not from relief alone, but from the overwhelming realization that the man she'd failed had become someone extraordinary, someone who'd turned his pain into purpose instead of bitterness. Over the following months, she worked harder than she ever had, rebuilding not just her professional reputation, but her understanding of what it meant to keep her word. Theo, now a teenager who remembered fragments of a kind nurse from his childhood, watched his father model something profound, that strength wasn't about punishing those who hurt you, but about becoming someone unshakable enough to offer grace anyway. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share it with someone who needs to believe that broken promises don't have to be the end of the road. Before we close, if you're watching this and it moved you, comment the word grace below. I'd love to see how many of you believe in second chances. In the years that followed, Northbridge Vantry Logistics became known not just for its success, but for a culture of integrity that employees said was unlike anything they'd experienced elsewhere. Callum never spoke publicly about why he'd made the acquisition, letting people assume it was simple business ambition. But those closest to him knew the truth, that sometimes the most powerful response to being broken isn't destruction, but the quiet, unshakable decision to build something better, and to leave the door open, just slightly, for redemption.